Thank you. So going from my immediate, we have Julie Biem with NATO, Xavier Pasco for the Fondation pour la Stratégique Recherche, Erin Pobjie with IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Stéphane Vesval with Airbus Defence and Space. All right, so let's start with Erin. Erin, your excellent book, Prohibited Force, The Meaning of Use of Force in International Law, was published last year. In it, you spell out a framework to identify prohibited uses of force, including those that take place in newer military domains such as outer space. Could you walk us through the thinking on that and how it applies to non-military actors?
Okay, thank you, Victoria, also for the opportunity to have a panel on this topic, the Paris Summit for Space Sustainability. So as we've seen in the last few days, space safety, space sustainability, and space security are interconnected. So it's great to have the opportunity to bring this topic to the discussion. We've seen the increasing militarization and weaponization of space, and we all understand the geopolitical context that has led to this. This context is also the reason that discussions about agreeing new norms of responsible behavior in space and the prevention of an arms race in space have been stymied and are not really progressing. From my perspective as an international lawyer, I see that there is already a fundamental rule that binds all states and also applies in outer space that has relevance to this area, and that is the prohibition of the use of force between states in their international relations. So this is set out in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, and the International Court of Justice has stated that this is actually the cornerstone of the Charter, and it's actually the basis of the modern international system, that states shouldn't use force to resolve their international disputes, but should do so using peaceful means. Now, what does it mean? How do we interpret and apply the prohibition of the use of force in outer space? In my book, Prohibited Force, I set out a framework for doing that, not only in space, but across different types of domains and to these kind of gray zone activities. And in a nutshell, it's basically identifying the contextual requirements for a use of force to be prohibited. This means that it must be by a state and against another state in international relations. And then there's elements that make an act a use of force as such. So this refers to the means, which may be kinetic or non-kinetic, the effects, the severity, and whether or not there is a hostile intent. So these are not necessarily things you check off a list, but rather elements which are identified and then weighed and balanced to form a contextual assessment. The challenges of applying this in space include matters relating to attribution, so it can be difficult to attribute who is doing the act. Also, new forms of technology, which mean that acts which are temporary and reversible can also have significant effects, including military effects. The issue of space debris and how this is considered in the assessment, and then difficulties around determining intent. This is relevant, for example, to rendezvous and proximity operations. In terms of how this applies to or is relevant to commercial actors, under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, the acts of commercial actors in space can be attributable to a state, and this means that commercial actors could accidentally or unintentionally implicate a state in a violation of international law, including the prohibition of the use of force. Commercial actors can also be targeted by adversaries, as we have seen in the Russian war against Ukraine. And in certain circumstances, this targeting of commercial space assets could also violate the prohibition of the use of force.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's really indicative of how just the geopolitical domain is changing. And with the evolution of the use of space, we're having these increasingly gray areas in terms of what legal responsibilities are. And that's why I think the work you're doing is so important to really kind of suss out what does it actually mean there. So next, I'd like to shift to our commercial perspective. Stéphane, how does Airbus manage uncertainty and risk with the dual-use nature of space systems as both an operator and a systems provider? Specifically, how does your company ensure that it's protected, financially or otherwise, against possible physical interference or retribution for its assets being used in national security missions and even possibly active conflicts?
I think what is interesting to to understand and to map, perhaps, it's where we are coming from and where we are today. Because there are indeed been quite a very significant evolution. I mean, dual commercial military, that's not exactly where we are coming from. We were coming from more of a scientific background. After that went into the commercial. The governmental business has always been around, but I think that the way it has grown over the past years made it, I would say, a central pillar. And it's the topic of this interconnection between this commercial and this governmental business that is now really structuring our business environment. For us, in any case, we have always been a strategic industry. So we always know, we have always been, in a way, an industry which is targeted also because of the knowledge and the experience that we are bringing and the capability that we are bringing in the country. And each time when we are looking at this topic, we are looking at it from 3 dimensions. The first one, I mean, the governmental business, being a key driver, it brings the topic of sovereignty, which is a complex word because it has so many different meanings depending on who you are talking with. But basically what it means is that us, when we are working for our governments, it means that we need to be a trusted partner. Trusted partner as an industry, also meaning that we need to master our dependencies, we need to master our skills, our labor force, and our facilities, but also a trusted partner as an operator. I mean, we are a service provider, we are delivering service to governments, and governments need to see that we will be there when they need us, and that we will not just be responding that, sorry, we are doing something else, or no, we don't really like what you are doing, so we may not get into that. So the sovereignty aspect and how do you create this trusted ecosystem, it can sound simple, but it is a complex topic. A second aspect, it's the technology. I would say the reason why also we are becoming and growingly important in the domain of the defense, it's also linked to the performance of our technology. I mean, since the beginning, I would say we are driven by top-class performance. So I would say by nature, everything that we are doing has a dual use of interest, and we are discovering new interest, especially now that we are going into SSA, or that we are doing into the topic of how do we master the space environment. And a last point, which is very important, and you just touched on it, and it's a tough one to manage. I mean, we still believe that we are in a world which is ruled by law. So we are sticking to firm compliance to these laws. Laws for us, it means export control. It means various regulations. It means also and we have a deep sense of responsibility. It's about keeping a clean space, because there is a lot happening up there. It's absolutely great to see that we are launching, and that we have so many satellites which are going around. But I think that it is all our joint responsibility as industry, as commercial operators, and as government, that space remain a clean environment, because I mean things can go badly very quickly, and for many years, for decades, or centuries to come. So that's how we are looking at it from these 3 dimensions.
Great, thank you. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, I think it's fantastic. I agree. A clean space environment is really important, and it should be a priority, I would argue, for all operators. But that seems like something almost one thinks about in peacetime situations, not necessarily times of conflict. Are there different things you guys think about when you're operating in a war zone or in a place of active military conflict?
In any case, when you start getting in this mode of trying to... so we have quite our background, in any case, in the military domain. That's not where we are coming from as a complete industry, but for many times, I mean, especially in the UK, we have been the operators of the telecommunication satellites for the UK MOD. We have also been the guys who were boots on the ground to support them to install their network and so on. So I think that what is absolutely key, and where you develop the mindset when you are in this environment, is that you are defining your threat cases. And you're trying to understand, okay, what are my threat scenarios? What do I need to be resistant to? So in that mindset, we have a certain level of anticipation, I would say, and we are quite comfortable to evolve in that environment. Nevertheless, the number of threat cases is just increasing very significantly. And I think that the main topic here, in any case, is just, it's a bit like deterrence, or it's that you have to show that you have the strength to discourage the other to go into that race of how do you just do more and more all the time, because it's a race which can have no end.
Very good point. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So we're moving on to a military perspective. Julie, with NATO. NATO announced in 2019 that it viewed space as an operational domain. The next year, it established the NATO Space Center, which has since evolved into the NATO Space Operations Center. How has NATO's broad priorities for space matured over the past 5 years? And how did that shape the creation of NATO's commercial space strategy, which was released earlier this year?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. I know that I am quite the outsider to this community. You know, space security is a broad topic, but you guys are working on something much more important than, you know, the policy work that we're doing there. Maybe I would love to kind of connect this question with the overarching question of this panel being, how do we disentangle commercial and military aspects of space security in this world? And first and foremost, I absolutely agree that the world in space that we see now is driven by commercial actors, right? The center of gravity really for space security and space operations has shifted to commercial, and any credible deterrence and defense in space has to take that into account. So that is kind of the first part of the answer to that question. So this brings us to the question of how do we clarify the relationship? How do we disentangle this? And then also, how does that shape our view as NATO? And actually, I would like to turn this around. In 2022, Russia made it explicitly clear that they see any commercial actor as legitimate targets. That is something that we have to take into account when we're working with commercial actors in space, generally speaking. Of course, Ukraine, writ large, has shown us explicit lessons learned from a space perspective. You know, the military use of commercial space providers is really, it's a central element of their defense today. And of course, we have been watching that very closely, and we learned our lessons from that. We are shaped by kind of two strategies now at NATO. The first one you already touched upon is the overarching space policy, which was made in 2019, which was before Ukraine, before the boom in space, in this commercial space sector. And with it, NATO defined two things. The first thing is space is an operational domain for us. That means we will conduct space operations there if needed for defense. However, at the same time, allies also decided that we as NATO would not own space assets on our own. We're not an autonomous space actor. This quickly gets into a nitty-gritty bureaucratic language of what does this actually mean. But I think what it comes down to is we will not own our own space assets. You will not see a satellite that has a little NATO flag on it. However, this did bring us to the commercial space strategy, which you already touched upon. Because really, we still, as I said, need to be able to use, for example, ISR data, which is still something that, you know, is needed in military operations and that NATO needs for its posture, for its deterrence, for, you know, all of the activities that go on all the time. And of course, for that, we kind of try to figure out what is it that the commercial sector needs, but also that allies need when working with the commercial space sector. And that's where the commercial space strategy brings us together. We really looked at some of the strategies that we see within our allied countries, particularly, of course, the US being a big forerunner here. And we kind of try to look at best practices there. And the first thing that we're going to set up now is the so-called space front door, which should become a larger thing later. And on the one hand, it should really be a one-stop shop for industry to come and work with us. Because while we are a really small organization, if you look at it in an international perspective, we are incredibly complex. And it's really difficult for commercial partners to, you know, approach the right parts at NATO. But at the same time, this front door should be our technology radar into the allied markets to understand what is out there, what capabilities are out there that we need, where we want to advance our technologies, all of those things. Building on that, we want to build kind of an e-commerce platform that makes it easier and more flexible in terms of procurement, which is one of the main aspects that commercial partners told us is their pain point when working with NATO. And as part of that is something that you just touched upon, that's the whole topic of trustworthiness. Of course, we need to be very vigilant in who are we working with. We cannot have specific investors, for example, in the background, or if you're working with XYZ government, that might be an issue when you try to work with us. That is something that we want to understand better, and we are going to establish over that. And then lastly, there's a lot of stuff in this commercial space strategy. I just kind of picked out the raisins, as we say in German. We want to better integrate commercial partners into our exercises and operations to, you touched upon this, while we're in peacetime, everything is kind of, you have more time. But when the rubber really hits the road, you already need to be trained. You need to be well-versed in the operations. And that is something that we want to integrate better. And then, of course, lastly, that was already touched upon in an earlier panel today, contractual and financial risk mitigations. This is something that we want to explore, mechanisms for this. We are in an alliance of 32 countries. We also work with consensus. We have to bring everyone to the table. But we also think that that's a great strength. We can bring these countries together and kind of find a mechanism where we can share responsibility and turn around to our commercial partners and say, we can protect you somehow. I can't make any promises of what that will look like in the future. And also, frankly spoken, this will take a lot of time. We're starting out. We have our first steps, and we're working on the development of the back end for this front door, all of these things. But we also need, the industry, you, the think tanks, you, the young generation, to help us do this shift in kind of the landscape that we're working in. So I hope that gave kind of some clarity on the question.
Definitely, thank you. Yeah, and as to that last point, the idea of figuring out indemnification, I mean, that's really the hard point for that. I know both the U.S. DoD and the U.S. Space Force released commercial integration strategies last year, and they both said, yeah, we got to think about that. And then when you ask them, okay, how? They're like, well, that's kind of the tough part. So I recognize in the NATO commercial integration strategy, you guys identify that as a goal to work towards as well, correct? Yeah. So, yeah, hopefully there'll be evolution as we see this mature. Xavier, kind of talking like big picture look at this discussion with your knowledge and expertise. Can you give us a kind of a view of France and kind of an overall assessment of how countries are doing this sort of thing? To your knowledge, is France trying to increase its use of space for national security missions? And if so, how? And then kind of overall looking at how other governments are doing this, what is your overall assessment how countries have been clarifying responsibilities of and liabilities for commercial actors in active military conflicts? How can those government efforts be expedited to meet immediately pressing needs?
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. And a lot of things have been said already, and I will, in fact, certainly repeat some stuff. And again, it's an outsider view here. I'm certainly not part of the French government, so I won't have this ambition to...
but as an expert who's been following the conversation...
I'm following this for a few moments, yeah. Well, what I see, what we can see from our hand, are attempts, in fact, to adapt from governments to this new evolution you described, but both from a mission and from a capability point of view. And I think we have to distinguish these two things. And, traditionally in France, but it's not only in France, it's, I think also in the US, you had a division of work between different missions, and you have traditionally the hardcore military missions that have been, really taken care of by owned DoD, MOD's owned resources and capabilities. And this is clearly something that military are not ready to give up in terms of mastering, controlling end-to-end capabilities, and that's for sure. And we still have this. But there is usually, and Stéphane touched upon this, a second circle, I would say, which is the trusted partners, precisely, which is something in between the purely commercial and the purely military. And this is really at the heart of our question today. And I think from the French perspective, what we see is indeed there is an accent put on maybe a modernization of this second circle, and maybe the relationship between the second circle and the first circle. And that's where the pressure is put, I would say. The point is how to, for a ministry, how to leverage capabilities that are outside their ownership in terms of systems they may use. And a few weeks ago, by the way, so it's very timely having this discussion here today, there has been something called the Space Pact that's been launched by the DGA. So the DGA is the French procurement agency for the Ministry of Armed Forces. And it's interesting, beyond the simple fact that, it signals some sort of a modernization. The way it's done, I think, is interesting in a sense that it's really crafted in a way to get players closer to each other and learn from each other. And I think this is certainly one element that was missing in this organization. It's nice to have a nice division between patrimonial, trusted partners, etc. But if you don't make the things communicate and better know each other, it's going to be difficult. So they really want to make sure that a consolidated ecosystem, industrial ecosystem, is better prepared to answer their surging needs. But better prepared not only in terms of capabilities, but in terms of practices, in terms of their own constraints and their own objectives, how it can be rendered more fungible, more compatible with the DoD needs. And I think this is where it's interesting. What we see today are new strategies to make sure that things can work smoothly, a little bit in parallel to what we see in technology. We were talking about dual-use technologies. We were talking about, I used to say space has become agnostic in a sense, We're talking about infrastructures. We don't talk about vertical systems anymore. And the fact that you can use these technologies because of the digitalization and all the things, it becomes more and more, the light is on the users themselves. And it feels like this new pact really gets the player closer to each other, with a mutual understanding from each part towards the other. First, from the ministry part, they have to maybe make known better their own practices and constraints and what means, military uses of space systems, but also for the ministry to better know the constraints of the industry. And it can be technological constraint, it can be export constraint, it can be, this is the usual industrial life. So I think it's interesting. I think this pact, if I understand well, I checked yesterday, it's about 50 companies, both traditional and startups. And this also is interesting because it's often opposed. Maybe it's not the case so much anymore. And it's complementing a similar view that's been organized also at the forces level with confidence structure that has been also for the missions this time created some months ago. So I think it's interesting. So and then we stop there. I think the key element now is how to make this second circle better adapted to the first one, and how to make the first one better adapted to the second one. And I think, okay, it doesn't solve the question here, but it will put the thing here. And another thing I want to add quickly is that using commercial system as weapon system is not, to my knowledge, in the minds of the military here. When you're waging war, you're using systems that are dedicated to this, with people who are dedicated to this. And by the way, it's been also the reason, for example, of the creation of something like the Space Command in France. I mean, you have to have military uniform people, taking care of the satellites, etc., etc. So I will stop there, but I think we have this progression here.
It sounds almost like the Space Pact is kind of similar to the NATO front door, right? In terms of
in a sense
of getting to know what the commercial sector can provide. But I would actually push back a little bit on the idea that the military only uses tools that it's designed to, because I mean, if you think about getting like Earth observation, imaging and stuff like that. I mean, the commercial sector is having an explosion of capabilities there that are being used for targeting or just intelligence gathering or anything like that. It isn't necessarily only military EO systems, right?
And especially for targeting. When you're talking about targeting, you're talking a very serious function, and you need to make sure that this is done. I would say in a secure way in terms of legal responsibility, in terms of political responsibility and moral responsibility, etc., etc. So I think we must prevent ourselves to think too quickly to the things, and a lot of details are very important.
Details are always very crucial. Okay, so I can see there's some questions coming in. That's great. A general reminder, if you do have questions for the panelists, please submit them via the Whova app or the Whova portal. But I have some more thoughts I'd like to get out of our panels before we shift over to that part of the conversation. Erin, back to you. How does international humanitarian law apply to space and where commercial actors might be operating in legally gray areas? And what does it mean to be a lawful target? From a IHL perspective. And then finally, what further discussions are needed to clarify what effect that might have on commercial actors involved in active military conflicts?
Okay, thank you for the question. And I think this ties very well into issues that were touched upon by my co-panelists in relation to mapping threats or identifying risks and thinking about protection against those risks, not only in terms of indemnification, but physical protection as well. So basically, international humanitarian law, which is also known as the law of armed conflict, is a body of international law that regulates the conduct of hostilities during armed conflict. Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty makes clear that international law, which includes international humanitarian law, applies in outer space. These rules are mostly set out in the 4 Geneva Conventions and their 2 additional protocols, and they also form customary international law, meaning that they bind all states. So similar, or the same as the first body of law that I mentioned earlier, which is the prohibition of the use of force, IHL binds all states and it applies in space. This is important for commercial actors who are engaging in these dual-use services, for reasons that I'll come back to in a moment. But just to briefly outline what IHL requires, key principles are the principle of distinction, which makes it prohibited to launch indiscriminate attacks or to intentionally target civilians or civilian objects. So only military objectives or combatants may be made the object of an attack. There is the principle of proportionality, which means that an attack must not be launched if the incidental loss or damage to civilians would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated by the attack. And finally, the principle of precautions, which means that the selection of the target and the means and method of attacking that target should be done in a way to minimize civilian losses. What this means for commercial actors is that dual-use capabilities can be considered military objectives, which means that they can be lawfully targeted during an armed conflict. A military objective is an object which, for a specific time, through its nature, location, purpose, or use, makes an effective contribution to military action. And in the circumstances ruling at the time, its partial or complete destruction, capture, or neutralization would result in a direct military advantage. This means that in the case of commercial services in space, which are used for targeting, as Victoria mentioned, that those assets could be lawfully targeted during an armed conflict. Furthermore, individuals, because you mentioned boots on the ground in relation to the UK MOD services, an individual, although they may be a civilian, such as a satellite operator, could also be lawfully targeted under the law of armed conflict for such time as they are directly participating in hostilities. So combatants can always be targeted, but civilians can be targeted under really strict circumstances if they're directly participating in hostilities. So for the time that the satellite operator is undertaking that operation, then they may also be the subject of an attack, which is a risk that must be considered. The purpose of these rules is to protect civilians, civilian population, and civilian objects from the effects of armed conflict and to minimize unnecessary suffering, something that should really be considered in this increasing intermingling of military and commercial space assets in the architecture of space, is that civilians also rely on space systems and services, which is relevant when, for example, when it comes to hosted payloads, if there are other payloads on the satellite bus which are providing services essential to civilians with respect to communications or other things. This is something to consider. One point I would like to mention is that often when we're discussing the targeting of commercial actors under the law of armed conflict, what is forgotten is that even if an objective can be lawfully targeted under the law of armed conflict, there is another body of law that applies, the first one I mentioned, which is the prohibition of the use of force. This means that if a Western commercial satellite company is providing military services to Ukraine, for example, there is an armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There is not an armed conflict between Russia and the United States, for example, in the case of Starlink. This means that Russia cannot target the assets of the United States, which could include its commercial space assets, in a way that would violate the prohibition of the use of force. There are only two exceptions to this prohibition. A state can use force in self-defense when it is the victim of an armed attack or an imminent armed attack, or if the UN Security Council authorizes the use of force, which is clearly not happening in this situation for obvious reasons. So this means that there is an additional barrier to lawfully targeting commercial satellite companies or operators.
And we actually saw the consequence in civilians when Russia first invaded Ukraine in February 2022, right? When they did the cyber attack on Viasat ground terminals to interfere with Ukrainian military communications. It also took out, a lot of transponders for people all over Europe, and it really affected that consequence. But yeah, so I think it's interesting to see how this evolves. But also in terms of what countries recognize that IHL apply to space, right? Most countries do, but there are a few that don't, aren't there?
Yes, so Russia has been quite vocal in its opposition to the position that IHL applies in space. There have been a couple of other countries that also take this position, though for different stated reasons. Russia has argued against the application or applicability of IHL in space because they have stated that they see this as somehow legitimizing a use of force in space. This is contrary to the object and purpose of this body of law, which is to minimize civilian suffering or unnecessary suffering during an armed conflict. And the ICRC has also noted that IHL doesn't legitimize use of force. It merely tries to regulate the conduct of hostilities when an armed conflict occurs.
Thank you for that clarification. Going back to Stéphane, Airbus provides multiple types of services to militaries, primarily military satellite communications and Earth observation for intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance. Does the type of service being provided change how Airbus thinks about ensuring the safety and security of its space assets? And what about the end user? In your experience, have different national actors using your products approach this differently?
So as I mentioned earlier, in any case, we have always been a strategic industry. So there's always been a bit of a sense that we are a potential some sort of a target. So we are, in that respect, an industry which has always been close to our authority with regards to managing securities. The growing topic also which has come over the year, it's the topic of cybersecurity, which is of course the main topic through our ground segments and also through the control of our satellites. So very much us, we are quite connected in all these domains with regards to to our government users. As I said earlier, and Xavier pointed out, the main point for us is how do we create this safe environment to have a trusted ecosystem. Trust is the thing that you build over years and decades, and that you lose in a fraction of a second. And so it is an everyday work. So it's really, the topic is in any case deep in our mindset. And it's the fact that it is deep in our mindset that we do have that trust. Because what our governments are seeking when they are coming to us, they are not seeking technology. They are looking for operational capability and the trust that we will deliver on that operational capability.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think trust is always going to be key for this. And how you demonstrate good intent and acknowledgement that there's a responsibility for space actors to be responsible actors in the space domain. Julie, going back to NATO, is NATO striving to ensure that its policies in commercial space are in line with that of its member states, and particularly the United States? And the reason why I bring up the U.S. is not just because American exceptionalism raising its head again, but specifically the U.S. Space Force has determined space to be a warfighting domain, and that's officially U.S. policy. As you stated earlier, NATO has declared it to be an operational domain. So how do you line up the two differences? And are there any other gaps in terms of how NATO approaches the view of its policies in commercial space versus that of its member states?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe first of all, we're not only talking to the US. France particularly is really developed in their space, operational space strategies. As well as the UK, as well as Germany and Italy and Spain. There are other actors among our 32 allies, but they have different approaches to this. And in terms of the comprehensiveness, it is true that the larger countries usually take or have the more comprehensive strategies. In terms of gaps that we see and the differences, yes, there are major differences. First and foremost, as I said, we're not going to own our own space assets, and that limits us in some way because we won't be able to go out. I mean, I wouldn't be able to go out and buy anything anyway. It would have to be, consensus by 32 allies through common funding. But what we do have is a lot of what we are doing is we're doing a lot of discussion and consensus building among the 32 allies and alignment between them. One of the things that I haven't mentioned earlier that we're also doing with the commercial space strategy is we're standing up the first committee at NATO that only has space subject matter experts in them. So one subject matter expert per country. That might seem late, but it is time, at least, better late than never, I'd say. So we now have that at NATO, where all 32 allies come together and discuss topics of standardization, interoperability, materials to use, what to invest in, what to look out for. And for example, we have these multinational corporations. One of them is called Starlift, and the other one is called Northlink. I know that's tricky in terms of what you can mix that up with. But in this, for example, not all 32 allies want to be invested in or have the drive to invest in the same capabilities, but 17 out of 32 want to invest in that. So these 17 can come together and invest in some of these capabilities, and many of them are commercially driven, for example. So that is something that we are trying to do. As opposed to, national strategies, we try to bring them together and say, okay, you have your national strategies, and of course, we honor them, but how can we as NATO help bring you together in your shared interest for capability investment, for example? So that is a big thing in what we're doing. And then again, as I said, we are aligning with all 32 allies. That's what these committees are for. Otherwise, we wouldn't do our jobs, to be honest. And yeah, that's really how we try to approach this.
Harmonization is key, it sounds like. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah,
do you
please.
mind? I realized that I skipped one point of your question when you asked me about global players and other, because we are by nature ourselves a global player. And what is very interesting around the world when you are dealing with the global players and the global export market, it's first, how do you address sovereignty? Because, I mean, how do you fit into a sovereign scheme when you are the outsider? And how do you maintain that trust? And the second point, as you were pointing out, I mean, we are not only on the manufacturing, but we are also on the service delivering. The very important point in all this is to understand the end user. Because, I mean, otherwise, it's very easy to do a business where we are just running everything just from where we are in Toulouse or in our home countries. But what matters is the guy on the ground or the guy who needs the intelligence, how is he going to use it? How do we serve the end user to make sure that what we do is impactful?
And do you find there's a variety of different ways in which the end users are using your services?
First, you have to mix the things like people have different meaning about sovereignty. People have different approach because we are in a business which is a lot driven by doctrine and ConOps, and the concept of operations can vary. In that sense, I come back on your point with NATO. That's also what is very useful to have this sort of common backbone where you know at least how to navigate between compatible concept of operations. But that's certainly the main points on how do you understand the needs of the end user and how do you fit their concept of operations with the service that you are delivering or the asset that you are delivering.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Xavier, a question for you. Widening the aperture some, where do you see the global community going in terms of blurring the line between commercial and military space? Is this something we're seeing other major space actors consider, like Russia, China, or India as well? And if not, why not? And if so, is their approach different from what we're seeing emerge in the West?
Yeah, I think this question can be answered in many ways, but I would like to focus on one aspect of it. And it goes back to what Stéphane just said, talking about the downstream services. I think this is a part we sometimes tend to misrepresent or maybe underestimate. I really believe that the increasing digitalization of space products is in our debate here a game changer in a sense. And I won't try to caricaturate the situation, but it in a sense diminishes the importance of actual equipment, satellites, ground stations, even if, and very quickly I correct what I've just said, military will always use specific satellites, ardent, specifically secured, etc., and ground station as well. But I think it's increasing this increased digitalization is increasing at the same time the blurring effect you were mentioning between military and civilian, and we have to keep that in mind. It's not only about using dual-use satellites, dual-use ground stations. It's about using products that have been produced. And I think we really have to focus on this. And what if I anticipate of it, if I project myself in a near future, and that's my guess, in fact, but what I can guess from what I can say the trend will be tomorrow is an ever-growing will and tendency to interconnect space infrastructures together, space platforms, just in order to take benefit of the sheer number of satellites. When you're talking about space, you're mentioning space to a uniform person, for example, immediately resistance, resilience, and fragmentation will come into his mind. And that's clearly this what is at stake today. They want to make things resistant, resilient, more resilient. So what you will do is push the digital technologies further. And you really can transform the current ecosystem in a sense. And then the relationship of these ecosystems with the current players at the governmental level. So I think it's important. And what I see from the US, but maybe you will correct me, Victoria, we may infer from what we see is, we see a multiplication of space infrastructures, by the way, both military and civilian. These things will talk to each other. And that's meant this way. And sometimes it will be military only, commercial only, or military adapted from commercial existing things. We see that more and more. It's really fueled by this digitalized environment in context in which it's taking place. And so it will have the global consequence to populate space with new architectures characterized by the diversity in terms of the initial objectives, I would say, but also with the technical similarities that will make them interoperable, functioning together, and ready to be used in a coordinated way. So I feel like China is following maybe this. Russia, I'm not sure. Russia has maybe other problems and maybe deeper problems in implementing these kind of things. But that's something that you can really infer from what you're seeing today. So I think we really have to put the question of what will this become in times of conflict? And that's really the point. I think when we're mentioning the responsibility of different actors, I would say the legal aspect of targeting this and this, it's in fact very wide. So it's inclusive in terms of the actors, the players that will be affected by that. So we need urgently to think to this, I think. This is new challenges, I think, for lawyers also to take this into account beyond the simple material aspect of all the things.
Thank you. All right, so we have some time for some questions. We've got quite a few from the audience, so I'm going to ask our panelists to be as succinct as possible so we can try and get through a few of them. But the first one says, Julie mentioned incorporating commercial space actors into exercises and other operations. Could you foresee some commercial space actors simply refusing to participate? I'm guessing due to concerns about, having blowback from participating in active conflicts. And how would NATO respond to that? And I'm going to open up if anyone in the panel has thoughts about that as well. Commercial actors just saying, look, we're out. We don't want to have to deal with this. Start with Julie.
I mean, to be as distinct as possible, yes, I can see that happening. How we would deal with that, we would have to accept it. We're a democratic alliance, and we will not push anyone to do anything. So, yeah, we will deal with it. That's just how it is then.
Thoughts from the rest of the panel?
Yes, for some player, the question will be asked also between what they will learn from it and what are their moral principles in terms of what they do. So I think you will have a lot of gray zones here. So it will just add to the blurring aspect of things.
I would say that, yes, these concerns are understandable from an operational risk and financial risk perspective. On the other hand, there's increasing financial incentives for companies to offer these dual-use capabilities or services. For example, if we look at the announcement by the German Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, a couple of weeks ago, announcing a 35 billion investment in this sector by 2030. This is a great opportunity for the space industry. I think when it comes to unease that some may feel about providing these services morally or ethically, I also see that some consider that the situation has changed. In the past, though many people would have been against armament or rearmament and more in favor rather of disarmament, but now the situation has changed, and so we speak of active defense, passive defense, and so on. And so these capabilities aren't necessarily for the purpose of perpetrating an act of aggression or something, but they also have the purpose of protecting the civilian population and increasing resilience and contributing to national security, which is another consideration.
Yeah, I think that in any case, us in our name, we are called Defence and Space. So I would say that the debate was already addressed. But what is interesting is that where we have seen the shift is with regards to investors. Sometimes we are often having the comment from the investors, oh no, we don't really want to get involved in that. And we have seen quite a change, and a change recognizing that defense is actually positive. I mean, if you want to protect your way of living, democracy, freedom, and stuff like that, at some point, defense is playing its role.
And I will add, just from the U.S. perspective, that when the Space Force released its commercial integration strategy, it created a commercial augmentation space reserve, or the CASR. And basically what it does is it says the U.S. has the right to basically force companies to provide space capabilities in a time of war. And that's very similar to what it does for civilian airlines, for example. They say in times of conflict, they can make airlines transport troops, that sort of thing. Now, how the CASR works, the U.S. hasn't really figured out yet, but it is there.
Just I wanted to add one thing. When I mentioned the gray zones, it makes me think about a parallel with another domain, which is the TikToks and Meta responsibility, legal responsibility in terms of what it produces on the users, and especially, all this crisis with the teenagers, doing things, committing suicide, stuff like that. And when you look at this legal debate, what you see is that these guys, they say, we're not media, we're just technical provider of contents, and we're not editing the contents. And so we're not legally binded by this. So I think, okay, this is evolving. I know that legal debate is evolving very quickly on this, and I think in the right direction, by the way, but I think we might have this similar things because of this digitalization and because of the importance of the contents and of the information produced on this.
Good point. Thank you, Xavier. Another question. It says, how do you measure proportionality of attack? This might be something, Erin, you might weigh in, but if anyone else has thoughts on this, please jump in.
Sure. So proportionality is one of the most complex areas of the law of armed conflict, and I won't be able to do it justice in 30 seconds or something like that, but okay, so in 1 minute, basically the rule, which is a rule of customary international law as well, is that an attack must not be launched if it may be expected to result in civilian losses, so death, injury, or damage or destruction of civilian objects, which is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. What's difficult about this formula is that you're comparing two completely different things. It's difficult to make an assessment, and this has to be done from the position of the commander with the knowledge in advance of the attack, not retrospectively when you see how much the damage actually was. So this is challenging also from an operational perspective, but when it comes to attacks in space, for example, if we're trying to apply the proportionality requirement, something that places important restrictions on these operations in space is the fact of this dual use. It means that space assets which are military objectives, for the reasons I set out earlier, for example, because of their purpose or use, may also be important to civilians, and destroying or disrupting those assets may lead to civilian losses. This also has to be taken into consideration in the proportionality assessment. Furthermore, certain types of attacks, such as kinetic attacks, will produce space debris, some of which may be persistent and can also lead to further loss or damage in the space environment and to the death or injury of civilians, depending on what the actual impact of that is. And so certain types of attacks in space would probably violate this proportionality, this principle of proportionality, and also be considered indiscriminate in their nature.
And this allows me just a quick advertisement for something Securable was involved in, along with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, is that we put together a space security lexicon where we try and put together terminology that is often used in a lot of these space security conversations. And I think proportionality, that was some of the terms that we tried to describe. We had subject matter experts from all six, fluent in all 6 UN languages involved in the conversation. So I encourage people to look that up. I have one last question from the audience, and then I want to go to final thoughts from our panel. And this one's kind of a philosophical one. Can space really stay peaceful if military and commercial projects keep mixing? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, yeah, not to be too pessimistic, but is space still peaceful? We see operations that are definitely not peaceful anymore. And this is not me talking about some weird classified information. This is just me reading the news, right? Like there's stuff going on all the time. You can read it in the news. You know, there are satellites who have little, or there are objects, sorry, who have little other objects in there who definitely spy on others. There is determined destruction of your own satellites just to showcase that you have that ability. And with that, you create debris that then has security hazard issues for other, objects in space. So I don't know, not to be too pessimistic here, but is it still peaceful? I wouldn't be able to answer that very clearly, to be honest.
Right, maybe for a longer conversation. Other thoughts?
I would say that there is clearly a tension between current uses of space and these trends towards militarization and increasing weaponization of space, and the preservation of space for peaceful purposes as a domain of all humankind. There's a tension as well in the strategies of some countries. Like, it was announced yesterday that France pursues a posture of active defense in space. At the same time, France and other countries in Europe and the United States are pushing through this UN process for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, for more responsible behaviors in space, and for rules, norms, and principles of exactly that, responsible space use. I think these processes can happen in parallel. I think it will be it is more important than ever, really, to clarify the existing legal framework, these basic rules that apply that I mentioned, namely the prohibition of the use of force and also the law of armed conflict. And this can also be a way of establishing a foundation to building common understandings in other areas about what kind of behavior in space is threatening, what kind of behavior is responsible or irresponsible. And so gradually in this way, establish conditions for the future peaceful use of space.
Great, thank you. All right, we're almost out of time, and keeping in mind we are what's between people and their coffee, but we have just a few minutes to give final thoughts. So I'd love the panelists just really quickly give me your thoughts on this. Looking ahead, how would one say that policies guiding the intermingling of commercial space and national security missions have failed? How will we know if they have succeeded, and how do we get to success? So just real quick, just toss out your response to that. I appreciate it. Maybe starting at the end with Stéphane.
For me, my top key concern is just to make sure that everybody keeps the deep sense of responsibility. Because, of course, I mean, law is an important element, but space remains a fragile environment. And when things go wrong, they will go wrong very quickly.
Excellent point. Erin?
On a similar note, I would say that success looks like increased clarity about responsibilities of different actors, and also more emphasis or more consideration given to what the effects on civilians of all of this is. How can we protect civilians and the civilian population who is depending on these space systems and services?
Yes, very quickly, and going back to your previous question, the question could be, has space ever been peaceful by nature or by obligation? And in my view, it's been peaceful by obligation. You didn't want to escalate in space in the Cold War years. Now what we have is an industrialization of space, so space is getting more banal. It's less a sanctuary than it used to be, and we need to make sure that, as you just said, responsible behaviors prevail.
Yeah, I can only say +1 to everything that Erin said. I really think, personally, NATO is committed to a peaceful and lawful use of space, has always been. So kind of an environment in which there's kind of an adherence to these obligations. That is what success looks like, I think.
Hopefully that's what we'll end up seeing. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking this panel for a really lively discussion.